to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens. Welcome back to another episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. My name is Lee Johnson, and I am joined by my fabulous co-hosts Rick Lee and David Gunkel, and today we are going to be talking about meat. But before we get to that, let's get some drink orders and some rants or raves. David, I'm going to go to you first. What are you drinking?
So I today am still suffering through the lingering stages of COVID and therefore should not be imbibing too much in any of this stuff. But I will have an Asbach, which is a Weinbrand from Rudesheim, and it's a brandy, which my grandparents used to give me when we were sick. So I'm going to go old school and go with the Asbach. And I will be ranting about working with people. There's this thing that happens when you're in high school and they, ask you what you want to be when you grow up. And they ask you, do you want to work with people? Do you like working with people? Anyone who says I like working with people is lying. There is absolutely nothing good about working with people. As department chair, I've now learned that there is an inner voice in my head that says, don't work with people. It's bringing out my inner misanthrope, this entire experience. So just heads up for those of you who look at moving into administration.
Yeah, nothing teaches you all the things you wish you didn't know about your colleagues, like being chair.
That is exactly correct.
So, Rick, what about you? What are you drinking and what are you ranting or raving about?
I am going to have an Outlager by Local Option. Local Option, call us. And today I am raving about Patti LuPone.
A legend.
Yeah. Well, I recently heard an interview with her on New Yorker Radio Hour. And I mean, not only is she a fantastic Broadway actor, wonderful voice, her rendition of Ladies Who Lunch is like among the very best, but she just seems like a decent human being who you could sit down and have a drink with. So love you, Patti. Lee, what about you?
I think I'm just going to have a peppermint tea today. I've never really been a fan of hot teas, but for whatever reason, I've recently gotten into them, and that's my new favorite. And today I am ranting about toxic masculinity. So I'll refer you to Exhibit 1 billion in my stack of evidence of instances of toxic masculinity. But this week, I'm particularly ranting about the fact that the NFL has introduced new helmets this season. They're called Guardian helmets. And basically, it just provides extra padding for players on their helmets. You may remember that the NFL has been dealing with the CTE crisis, and I highly recommend everyone watch that Frontline documentary about the CTE crisis and the NFL. But first of all, they didn't require that players wear these Guardian helmets, including the linemen, which were really the players that should be wearing them. But it does appear that of the few players that have opted to wear the Guardian helmets, they're just getting a lot of unnecessary shit from the commentators, from other players and news media outlets. And, that's just crazy. I mean, it's a safety issue, right? Like, these guys don't want to be eating Jell-O and drooling in 20 years. And so they're doing the smartest thing that they can do at this moment. It reminds me also that there's this guy that walks around my neighborhood and he wears a t-shirt that says "Real Men Eat Quiche," which was like a thing in the 80s and 90s. I don't know if you remember this. Yeah. But I just thought, you guys are just not sending your best people. That's all I'm going to say.
My worry is that we are.
All right. Well, today we are going to be talking about meat and meat eating or not eating meat. And David, this was your idea. I think it's a great idea. So how did you want this to go?
So, early in the gay science, Friedrich Nietzsche makes the following remark about something that seems to be missing from the history of philosophy. What is known, Nietzsche writes, of the moral effects of different foods? The constant revival of noisy agitation for and against vegetarianism proves there is no such philosophy. In today's episode, then, we want to make an attempt at developing this philosophy. And we're going to get there not by engaging with what Nietzsche calls the noisy agitation for and against vegetarianism, but sinking our teeth into the meat of the matter, Yes, today we are going to talk about meat. Humans have been eating other animals for close to 2.5 million years, a fact that is evidenced by the cut traces on fossil animal bones, surviving stone tools, and analyses of our ancestors' teeth. But does this evolutionary fact render meat eating physiologically necessary and morally justifiable? Our ancestors did a lot of things to survive, but is that sufficient reason to continue the practice? How they obtained this meaty source of protein was very different from the industrial practices of animal agriculture that are justifiably criticized for their cruelty to non-human sentient creatures and their contribution to the global climate crisis. Can we, as a species, continue to eat meat? Or in doing so, are we literally eating ourselves out of house and home? And what about lab-grown frankenmeat, which friend of the show Ron DeSantis recently made illegal in the state of Florida? Is lab-grown meat a solution? And how and why is the unassuming Impossible Burger now a subject of the culture wars? So join us at the table as we sit down to talk meat.
Meat.
So there are a number of ways to come at the issue of meat, but let's start with some basics. Is eating meat healthy? There's this discussion of some meats being more or less healthy than others. We had the whole pork as the new white meat in the 20th century. Is there really something to this, or is it all just marketing that we're having to contend with here?
What's funny about starting in this way is that last term I was teaching a text of Aristotle, in fact, the Ethics, in which he talks about light meat as healthy. And I was saying, I went to my doctor and she said my cholesterol's high, I should eat light meat. And what Aristotle's pointing out is that I don't know what's light meat. I mean, I do because I see it in a clear plastic in the store, but if a chicken's walking by, how the hell would I know whether that's light meat or not? And so, we talked about the example and so on. And afterwards, this student in the class who's pumped, totally jacked, he's like, you know that white meat isn't any healthier than red meat. And I'm like, yeah, I kind of knew that, I think, but so what's the point? And he's like, well, I just wanted you to know. So apparently no meat is healthy, according to this jack dude in my class.
So from Aristotle to jack dude, there's a major shift in the definition of what is healthy meat.
Well, I think most meat eaters believe that meat is healthy because of the protein content. And a lot of meat eaters will say about vegans and vegetarians that they don't get enough protein. Now, that's not true, and we can come back to that later. There are plenty of plant-based proteins. But it is something that we know, that we need protein to survive. So in that sense, you could say, yeah, meat is healthy in as much as it is a source of protein, and protein is something that we need in order to live healthy lives. It's not necessary, though, as a source of protein.
Sure.
So I think that's really the question that you're asking.
There are obviously other ways to get protein, as you were just pointing out, Lee, like legumes and things like that don't have similar side effects that meat eating does, like raising cholesterol levels. I mean, and that's just to talk about the health aspects before we get into the other aspects of why maybe legumes are better than meat.
And this sort of gets into this identity question, because people will identify themselves as pescatarians or omnivores or carnivores. And one carnivore will say to another, well, I don't eat red meat, I eat pork and chicken. And you see ways in which this creates alignments between various identities of what we consume. And it's weird because it's all just food, but it creates these boundaries. You are defined by what you eat.
I think the light meat or white meat is healthy was a boon to the chicken industry, because as a meat eater, I would say beef tastes way better than chicken. But at least now they had something to say, like, yeah, okay, it doesn't taste as good, but it's healthy.
Also, just want to remind people that in addition to land animals and sea animals, there are also bugs which are also meat. And although I consider myself an omnivore, I don't eat bugs. I am a meat eater, but I don't eat bugs. I don't know. There are some sea animals that are basically bugs, but you know what I mean. I don't eat land bugs that I know of.
Right.
So yeah, there's lots of forms of animal meat. David's right that even meat eaters sort of divide themselves up in certain ways, largely, I think, based on the health benefits of the meats that they're choosing to eat or not eat. I think that's a different argument than the argument that meat eaters will make to vegetarians about the so-called health benefits of meat.
The lack of protein argument, you mean?
Right.
Yeah.
So I want to get to the vegetarian meat debate in a second, but I just want to highlight this idea of eating bugs that Lee just mentioned, because historically human beings have eaten bugs, and various cultures eat more bugs than other cultures. And I think in the United States we have this revulsion. I can't eat a bug. But there was a little shift that happened recently with the cicada invasion in the Midwest. And I heard one chef refer to cicadas as air shrimp. Which I thought was an amazing little linguistic rebranding, because they are somewhat like shrimp, and I've actually eaten cicadas and they're quite delicious. But the fact is that, there are certain meats that are off the plate for various individuals and various communities because they've been decided and defined as somehow being not suitable for human consumption, even though they are just as good a source of protein as any of the other meats that are in circulation.
Yeah, and while we're still on meat eaters, I also want to just reinforce David's point that there are certain meats that are, what did you say, off the plate for certain meat eaters. I mean, I think most Americans would not eat a cat or a dog. Some people, for moral reasons, won't eat veal or foie gras. So, I mean, it is finicky how we decide which meats are edible, or which meats we should eat because of health reasons or moral reasons.
To follow David's point about the bugs are off the plate, there are also, in the U.S. in particular, parts of animals that are off the plate that are consumed happily in other parts of the world. I mean, it's hard in your chain supermarket to even find tripe, let alone pig snout or trotters, pig's hooves and internal organs and all of these kinds of things that other cultures think are both delicious if prepared well, but also if you're going to sacrifice the life of an animal, then you best get all you can out of that animal.
Although I do think recently there has been more restaurants rising up around the country that brand themselves as, nose to tail restaurants.
Yeah.
So this gets us into the moral territory of things, I think. And is there a moral reason for or against meat eating? Is vegetarianism better, morally speaking? We all, I think, at one point have had conversations or encounters with vegetarians that have that sort of moral superiority when they talk about what they eat compared to what other people don't or do eat. So is this all lifestyle choice, or is there something more philosophically interesting going on in this debate about the morality of what it is we eat?
I used to use this a lot in my classrooms as an example of the ways that we can sometimes hold moral positions that we don't actually follow in our day-to-day lives. So I am a meat eater. I don't eat cats and dogs and bugs, but most other meats, I don't eat foie gras, but that's because I don't like it. But most other meats I do eat. However, I am thoroughly convinced by the moral argument against eating meat or eating animals. And I don't have a good excuse for why I don't just become vegetarian. I mean, I will jokingly say bacon, but that's not really, it doesn't really rise to the level of an argument. I think that in many people's lives, it is a choice that they then kind of ex post facto make an argument for. I am totally comfortable, well, not comfortable, but I'm honest about the fact that I do think that the moral argument against eating meat is a good and compelling and convincing one. But for whatever reason, it hasn't motivated change in my life.
For me, what's interesting is the moral ground for not eating meat has, I think, empirically gotten stronger because we've now learned that the form of agriculture we use mostly in the West and the global North for producing animals for human consumption is also ecologically unsustainable.
Yeah.
And is part of what's leading us to a global climate catastrophe. And so, in a strange way, because of other reprehensible things we have done, we've actually now brought about a situation in which eating animals is even less morally sustainable than it was before. And I say that like Lee as someone who not only eats meat, but I quite enjoy it.
So we're going to get to the method by which we get our meat, because I think you're exactly right. The industrialization of animal agriculture is one of the major contributors to greenhouse gases, and it does have more to do with how we respond to the environmental catastrophe that's on the horizon. But we'll get to that in a second. I want to look at what Lee was talking about with regards to this moral argument, because the way the moral argument has been developed over time is somewhat inconsistent in the way that we've drawn the line between what is edible and what is not edible. It has to do with certain properties that we as human beings decide are the qualifying criteria for something to be non-edible versus edible. I'll give you a really basic example. One animal with a certain level of intelligence and sentience lives in the house with us. We call it a dog. Another animal with exactly or even better intelligence and sentience lives in the barn, and we slaughter it for food. We call that a pig. Mm-hmm. The difference is where we put them. One is in the house with us. The other is in the barn. Then you start drawing the line, and Peter Singer has this problem when he talks about animal rights. Okay, we're not going to eat mammals because mammals are like us, eyes on the front, fuzzy, and therefore we can eat fish because fish are cold-blooded things that live in the water, and so we draw the line there. But then you get people arguing about this sentience and consciousness of fish, and you move the line further downstream to the octopus. And oh my God, no, you can't eat octopus anymore because we now know new things about octopus. And the further down the food chain you go by drawing that line, I mean, even now you're talking about plant sentience and plant consciousness. Yeah. And so it appears that you can't eat anything without violating a kind of moral determination about these properties that we find to be somewhat necessary and important to be included in the community of moral subjects versus the objects that are raw materials. It just, I think, points out the fact that as living animals, eating requires killing. Eating requires that other beings sacrifice for us and for our sustenance. And where we draw that line tends to be based on our feelings as opposed to good empirical evidence that we can say, well, this is surely where the line should be drawn, as we've again and again seen it keeps moving on us.
One interesting aspect of the moral argument is it turns out in the end to be oddly ratiocentric. That is, we are the animals that are capable of making a choice about what it is we want to eat. And it seems something like reason is the capacity we have that allows us to both see that some living things are sentient or feel pain. And so therefore, we now have a moral responsibility that we would never put on a lion or a bear. And in a strange way, then, we put humans at the center in a way that I think most people who want to think about the way we treat animals would be uncomfortable with. But I don't see how the argument works without prioritizing rational beings over non-rational beings.
Right. We get to judge criteria in deciding these categories and how we divide the us from the them in the process.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm saying the same thing that you guys are saying, but it does seem to me that the moral argument against meat eating has to do with the capacity of animals that we eat to suffer.
Right.
And it might be the case that we have to anthropomorphize them in some way, read in their behaviors the capacity to suffer or the experience of suffering. That might be true. And yes, David's exactly right. I mean, we do have some scientific evidence that seems to suggest that, for example, grass can be afraid or, can suffer, or at least, I mean, again, this is all anthropomorphizing, right? I mean, this is all kind of projecting onto these beings who, if they have minds, we don't know those minds. But still, it doesn't seem to me that primarily the animals that I choose to eat, I choose on the basis of whether or not I think they're rational. I choose it on the basis of how much I think they suffer. And there, I think you guys' argument is right, that if I'm going to eat cows and pigs, I should be eating dogs and cats and other humans for that matter. But I don't. So I'm not disagreeing with your argument generally, but I don't think that I would describe it as ratiocentric as Rick did. I mean, it does seem to be more, this is a terrible word, but spiritual in a way.
But here's what I mean by ratiocentric is that we don't place moral blame on the lion for eating the lamb. But the moral argument against eating meat does place moral responsibility on the human for eating a pig. And what's the difference there? The only difference is that we have the ability to make a choice that the lion doesn't. And then I ask, okay, what's the ground of our ability to make that choice? And I think most often someone is going to say something like, well, we have the capacity to reason. We have the capacity to look and think about suffering and then go from the issue of living things suffering to therefore I should not cause the suffering. And all of that requires reason. So that for it to be a moral issue, somehow I have to be the kind of being that can be morally culpable. I think that's where the ratiocentrism comes in, because most frequently that culpability is tied to a capacity very similar to reason.
Right, but we don't hold the lion responsible for eating its prey because we don't share morality with the lion. Morality doesn't exist in a state of necessity. Like, I'm not sure why comparing the argument that we make to other humans about what they eat to the arguments that we don't make to non-human animals, because we don't make moral arguments or any kinds of arguments with non-human animals. I'm not sure how that is significant.
Well, my question is why? So you give me one answer. It's the state of necessity. I'm not a biologist or a zoologist. I'm not sure that lions couldn't eat grass or leaves or berries or fruit or legumes or whatever.
But the point is that we wouldn't have any conversation with them about that. There'd be no moral judgment about it one way or the other. They're not making an argument in their own defense, and we have no way to blame them.
Exactly, right? Because they're not making an argument, and now you're saying that they're not showing a capacity for rationality.
Right. Let me pick up on this, but I want to press a little bit on the Cartesianism that seems to be operative behind the scenes here. We should ask the question, is eating meat even a choice? Or is not eating meat even a choice? Are there cultural aspects to meat eating that complicate this rather individualistic image of personal choice and reason that seems rooted in a Western Cartesian way of thinking about things? And if so, how does that affect our understanding of meat consumption or the choice, in quotation marks, to consume or not consume meat?
I mean, I would say pretty confidently that eating meat is a choice, that eating at all is a choice.
Wow.
I mean, I might exist in certain cultural, socioeconomic, even political contexts in which it's not the norm, but it's certainly not necessary that I eat meat or refrain from eating meat.
But it is necessary that you eat, right?
That I eat is something that I choose to do. It's necessary to survive that I eat, but it's not necessary that I survive. And I don't want to go back into the whole existentialism.
Right, I was going to say.
But, just as a basic philosophical point, eating is something that I choose to do. I choose to do it as to go back to Nietzsche, an affirmation of life. So if I'm choosing to eat, then I have to be choosing what it is that I eat. Again, assuming that I'm not like in prison and have no choice whatsoever about what I eat or don't eat.
But this is interesting because when you think about it, in terms of the Western philosophical canon, there's not a whole lot of philosophy about eating.
Right.
You see bits of it in Aristotle, you see some bits of it in Levinas, bits in Nietzsche, but there's not a philosophy of food. There's not a philosophy of eating. And it's so essential to our essence. We talk a lot about human essence and human nature and all this sort of stuff in philosophy, but we don't talk about eating. There's something about it that seems too physiological, too embodied for us to see it as important enough to raise to a philosophical concept.
I'm just trying to think, what would some of the questions be in a philosophy of eating? I mean, I think one is, Lee's, is eating a choice at all? But then when I get beyond that, I'm like, okay, so what else would we talk about in a philosophy of eating?
Well, you can imagine a different Cartesianism. I eat, therefore I am.
But that's not a philosophical argument, is it? It's a biological argument, right? As long as I'm still sustaining myself, then I am existing.
But you think about it, what Descartes wanted was an indubitable beginning point, right? And one thing that seems to be indubitable is that in order to be in existence, you need to consume something to maintain your existence. So it goes back to your existential question.
Mm-hmm.
But what I think is interesting is the point you raised earlier, which I think is also a Nietzschean point, namely that my choice to continue to exist leads to my choice to eat, which entails, whether I like it or not, something is going to die. Whether that thing is a plant or an animal, the choice to continue to exist is at the same time the choice for something else no longer to exist.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, I think that's right too. And just to get back to David's question, it is a choice. It is a choice what I'm going to make die or let live, to use Foucault's language. You know, I can't choose to not breathe. If I fall underwater and I'm drowning and I'm holding my breath, at some point, against my will, I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to take a breath of water. I'm going to drown, but I'm going to take a breath. But I can choose to not eat.
Right.
So when I choose to eat, I am choosing what else is going to die.
I agree. And you're bringing this to the fore makes me think that if we push too hard on the fact that to eat or not to eat, that is the question. And therefore it is a choice. If we say, no, it really isn't a choice, then we take away the entire power of the hunger strike. The reason why hunger strikes can be effective is because someone chooses, I would rather not exist than undergo what I'm undergoing.
Yeah.
And then it's interesting that a response that the prison industrial complex often has to that is forced feeding.
Right.
Yeah, so there would be an example of not choosing to eat.
Right. Yeah. Hey, Hotel Bar Session listeners, this is Rick Lee. Do you know what kind of pillow I use or mattress I sleep on? No, of course you don't. And that's because we don't have any of those stupid ads for pillows or mattresses or any other crap that you don't even want. We are supported by you, our listeners. And if you want to keep our late night conversations flowing, why not do the equivalent of buying us a drink or giving us a high five? You could subscribe to our podcast at Patreon. That's patreon.com/hotelbarsessions. And you could subscribe at many levels. And hey, there's perks at those levels. You could get a coffee mug, or I might even call you out on an episode, or you could get early access to some of our episodes. There are lots of perks there, and we could really use your help. So go to patreon.com/hotelbarsessions and subscribe at any level you feel comfortable with. In the meantime, we'll see you back at the bar.
All right, so far we've talked Aristotle, we've talked Descartes, we've talked Nietzsche. I want to add another philosopher to the
Don't
mix.
forget the
and
Jack
that's
dude in
Stephen-
my class.
Oh, the Jack dude, the very important Jack dude. And I want to add another philosopher to the mix. That's Stephen Colbert, but not the Stephen Colbert of The Late Show, but the Stephen Colbert of the Colbert Report, much earlier in his career. And there's a moment in one of his interviews where he says, if God did not intend human beings to eat meat, why did he make them so delicious? Now, it's estimated that the average meat-eating American is going to consume around 7,000 animals in their lifetime. Add to that the fact that the consumption of meat elsewhere in the world is on the rise, as meat eating is often perceived as a status symbol. As a result, that's a lot of meat. And my question is, can we support this level of consumption? Is meat eating in this way sustainable?
No.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely isn't. I mean, I think one thing that we are leaving out here is how deeply embedded meat eating is in American identity in particular.
Yeah.
We don't eat other human beings because we say the body is sacred, right? That it is the container of the soul and of the mind. But it's interesting how once we take that away from our understanding of the body and commodify it, it very quickly transforms the body from a temple into meat, basically. You know, the word chattel shares the same root with both cattle and capital. Our capitalist society is, in fact, built on an understanding of meat as part of the American identity. Wall Street was an abattoir first, right? They call the stock market because livestock were traded there. I mean, it is deeply embedded in what it means to be American. So I think that's something that we have to kind of push maybe to the forefront that meat eating is a cultural identity in the United States. Again, you guys pointed out an example of that when you noted that friend of the podcast, not really a friend of the podcast, Ron DeSantis has outlawed so-called impossible meats. There is a lot of red-blue divides between meat eaters and vegetarians and vegans. And so, I just don't want us to leave that point out.
And I only recently learned that one of the reasons why we in the U.S. don't eat so much lamb as people in other places in the world, and goat as well, has entirely to do with the Western cattle industry. Sheep and goats graze at incredible rates. They were out consuming cows. The cattle industry pushed to the side the sheep industry and the raising of goats for human consumption. And so now the cattle industry has even affected what we take as good meats to eat and not good meats to eat.
Mm-hmm. And to connect this up with our episode on immigration, it is immigrants to this country that eat lamb and goat. Mexican and South American immigrants or European immigrants from Mediterranean area. Lamb is associated with Greeks and Middle Eastern people, whereas goat is associated with South American peoples. And that becomes, again, a national identity in the way that we mark ourselves as true Americans. We eat the right kind of meat. We eat beef.
There's a lot of lamb and goat in African cuisines as well.
Yeah, there is. True.
Goat is one of the most widely consumed meats in the world, but you would not know it walking around a U.S. supermarket. I've never seen goat in a U.S. chain supermarket.
Nor have I, yeah. In fact, you have to go to a specialty store
where you will find a lot of people from other cultures.
But to get back to your original question, which was, is this sustainable? I mean, it seems pretty clear for environmental reasons that it's not sustainable. Sorry to just put my finger on the point here, but like cow farts are going to kill us. Right. They're killing the environment. They're going to kill us. I read somewhere recently that if each American not became vegetarian or vegan, but just simply reduced their meat eating by something like 25%, that would make a greater difference in our carbon footprint than many of the current options on the table for reducing our carbon footprint.
What's interesting is the reduction in the carbon footprint always images the automobile and heavy industry as the main source of the greenhouse gases, but it's really the industrialization of animal agriculture that contributes a whole lot of methane and CO2.
It's cow farts.
It's cow farts, yeah.
Well, to go back to a point that was made earlier, animals, it turns out, and cows in particular, are a really inefficient protein processing machine. In other words, they take in a whole lot more protein than they provide as food themselves. And so, in a sense, we're wasting protein from our planetary ecosystem by preferring the consumption of meat over the consumption of plants. We're reducing the amount of available protein.
It's also the case that wherever you have large slaughterhouses, they are themselves breeding grounds for viruses and diseases. And so there's other reasons, other kind of epidemiological reasons to not continue this level of meat eating in the way that meat is currently raised and slaughtered in the United States.
Which gets us right into the next issue I want to bring up. There are all kinds of good reasons to be critical of industrialized animal agriculture. The animals are retained in feed pens that do not permit movement. They are often standing or worse, laying in their own excrement. And they are typically force-fed antibiotics and growth hormones. But what about the alternatives? Are these new terms like free range and grass-fed any guarantee of better existence for these animals? Or again, are these just marketing slogans designed to ease the conscience of meat-buying consumers?
I mean, I'm pretty sure it's the latter. I mean, we already know that the label organic on any kind of food product is not regulated. So, I'm not sure that saying that something is grass-fed or free range is any more regulated than saying that some other food stuff is organic. I imagine that if the meat is actually grass-fed or free ranged, that it is better, both for our environment and for our health. But I don't know that it's not still just a marketing campaign.
Yeah, I'll say what I've learned about free range means that if the animal can turn around, that's free range by some definitions of the term, which means that, without any sort of regulatory framework for the terms organic, free range, grass-fed, the consumer doesn't really know what the difference is. It sounds good, but is it actually good is an additional question.
I mean, you have enough room to turn around as a thoroughly American sense of freedom.
But I think we're going to come very quick to a dead end because, on the one hand, people right now in the U.S. are complaining about the cost of groceries, and the cost of meat has risen dramatically. Now, that's all based on the industrialized practices we have, which are incredibly efficient because of all of these awful conditions that, David, you were pointing out. If we were to enforce real free range, like the chickens are able to walk for miles and maybe even fly the coop, God forbid, or the cows are on free and open pastures and are not forced to eat corn, the cost of meat would be much higher than even this recent spike in inflation brought about, in which case then we would be forced, it would seem to me, to fall back on eating more plants as a source of protein than animals. But I'm not sure Americans are ready to face that. And so I think the demand, in the US at least, is going to put pressure on the industrialized production of animals for human consumption.
And let's remember that it's not an option for everyone to fall back on the option of eating more plants. There are many, many, many so-called food deserts in the not so-called, I mean, that's what they are, food deserts in the United States, where it is extraordinarily difficult for people to access fresh produce. The food that is close by and accessible and affordable is mostly meat and processed foods.
Yeah.
Not produce.
Right. We used to think of meat and meat eating as a privilege, but actually fresh produce is also a privilege, and recognizing how poverty in particular plays a role in what people eat, I think, is really crucial here.
But since you pointed it out, I think it's also worth saying that in the US and now increasingly in the entire global north, we have bizarre produce eating habits as well. Like, why the fuck am I eating a tomato in the middle of January in Chicago? I have no business eating a tomato in the middle of January in Chicago. And yet, if there's no tomatoes in the supermarket, I'm going to go ballistic.
And they've got to be pretty tomatoes, too.
Yeah, they have to be pretty tomatoes. You know, God forbid my peach is bruised. And I think our produce eating habits are also unsustainable.
How then should we deal with some of these cultural differences regarding hunting and meat consumption? For example, with many indigenous communities, the hunt and the animal or animals that are hunted are a fundamental part of their identity. And we sit here as white folks in the Midwestern part of the United States. We can look at the harvesting of whales as being something that we find reprehensible. But for the Inuit peoples of the Arctic, hunting and eating whale is a defining cultural and religious practice. So how do we square our arguably privileged Western desire for animal rights and at the same time recognize these important cultural differences that are organized around the consumption of animal product and the use of animals in their various activities?
I think this goes back to the moral question that we were asking in the first segment, whether or not and to what degree what one eats is a choice. You know, yesterday I put a question up on my Facebook page that asked people to give me their reasons for being meat eaters or vegans or vegetarians or pescatarians or whatever they were. And I got dozens of responses, and they're many and varied why people choose to eat the things that they eat. But it did seem pretty consistent that everyone's belief was that it's a person's right to choose to eat whatever they eat. So I'll just say for myself, you know, I mentioned earlier that I think that there are really convincing and compelling moral arguments to not eat meat. Do I think that I have a right to say to either of you that you shouldn't eat meat? I don't know. I mean, I think I still would have to respect the fact that that's your choice to choose to eat meat or not to eat meat. And I would say the same thing about people across the world. Now, that may sound like a sort of weak relativist position, but I think that we can be compelled by the moral goodness or badness of something without also thinking that I have the right to impose that belief onto you. And I think for eating, for me, it's your choice.
I think, though, it's worth pressing, David, your cultural point here, because as you were talking about it, I started thinking about how European settlers in North America treated the indigenous peoples. Sure, there was a lot of outright explicit violence forcing tribal communities and families of tribal communities onto reservations or out of their native lands and so on. But we also did a number of things to eradicate their culture. For example, killing off the bison population in North America. Doing that destroyed a number of indigenous people's way of living in the world and finding their way in the world. Traveling around with the migrating bison population was just part of what these peoples were about. And many people in the US today think that, like, if you took beef out of our supermarkets, we could no longer be Americans.
And this point you bring up about the slaughter of the bison also draws attention to different kinds of ways animals die and for what purpose they die. The indigenous peoples did follow the bison and did kill, eat, and live off of that animal which they hunted. But what made what the white settlers did so much different from that is they just wholesale slaughtered, like bison genocide. I mean, they basically just wiped out the bison and laid the carcasses out in the field to rot. From the perspective of the indigenous tribes that lived on those animals and lived alongside those animals, that was an abomination, right? That was not only destroying their livelihood and their culture, but it was, in the eyes of their way of thinking and seeing the world, just an unthinkable act of violence. And I think that was deliberate. I mean, this is the way that you exert colonial power.
Hey, listeners. Have you ever thought to yourself, I'd really love to join them after this episode for a drink? Well, you could do that if you wanted to fly Rick and David from Chicago or me from Memphis to wherever you are, and we're not taking that option off the table. But in the meantime, we'd love to hear back from all of you via social media. You can reach us on Twitter at Hotel Bar Podcast, on Facebook, and on YouTube. You can always email us at hotelbarpodcast@gmail.com and we will respond. Look, we know you're out there. We've got the data and we want to hear from you. Books or articles we should read, interview guests we should have, topics we should cover. We're listening. Sometimes podcasting feels like shouting into a void, and so we always appreciate hearing back from our listeners. In the meantime, back to the episode. Let me ask you both a moral question, actually two moral questions. First, do you think that there's a moral difference between someone who eats meat that they buy from a supermarket or whatever, and someone who kills their own meat? That's the first question. And then the second question is, do you think there's a moral difference between killing an animal and killing an animal to eat it?
I'll go first.
Okay.
I would argue that there is no moral distinction between getting a ribeye in the supermarket and killing a cow to eat it. That is, I don't think someone who does not perform the execution and butchering of the animal is morally inferior to someone who actually kills and butchers their own animals. As for the second, I would argue that there is a distinction, an important moral distinction between killing an animal and killing an animal for the purpose of eating it. And I think that distinction goes back to this issue that in order for me to survive, something has to die. And that goes for the animal just as much as it does for me. But the cultural point then that David was making, I think, comes back in here. If something dies in order for another thing to survive, that's one thing. If something dies and then just rots, that's a whole other thing.
Oh, I wasn't talking about killing an animal for sport versus killing it for food. If you killed an animal in self-defense, like if a polar bear attacked you, is there a moral difference between that and killing an animal for food? It seems like in both cases, you're killing an animal to survive.
Ah, okay.
I'm not trying to make it moral defense of sport hunting here.
Right.
Oh, in that case, if I'm being attacked by a bear and I kill it, that might even be morally superior to killing the bear in order to eat it.
But this does bring an important aspect to the conversation here. We often forget that we too are edible and we too have been prey within the food chain. Not recently. I mean, since the last couple millennia, we've been at the top of the food chain. But there was a moment in our history where being consumed by another animal on this planet was a very real possibility for Homo sapiens. A situation that I think we conveniently forget because of the position that we currently occupy with regards to the other animals that we surround ourselves with.
But it seems to be almost universal among cultures all over the globe that human beings are not meat.
Mm-hmm.
Cannibalism is prohibited in almost every culture.
Except in situations where you find very dire circumstances, like you have a famine that ravages an entire region, and there's evidence of survivors through cannibalism, or, the people stranded in the Andes on a plane crash, right? We have these stories. There is a prohibition across human cultures against cannibalism, but there are exceptions that come to the fore when you look at situations of dire survival. And when that's the only choice or the only option, people have survived by resorting to it.
Yeah, no, I think that is definitely true. People have done it, but I still think in those situations that the moral prohibition has not been lifted. Most people would say, even if you found yourself dying in the Andes or, stuck amidst the icebergs on a ship, you should die before you eat another human being.
But, this is one of the ultimate ways in which you demonize the other that is located elsewhere in the world, right? When Columbus comes to the Caribbean, he describes the Indians, in quotation mark, that he finds as being cannibals. Now, he had no evidence of this at all, but it was a way of making the antipods so different from the Europeans as to justify conversion and colonial exploitation. By painting them as cannibals, you had this opportunity to morally situate them in a place that made them less human.
But do you guys think the moral prohibition on cannibalism is justified?
So here again, I would like to know, how would human flesh for human consumption be produced? I am not in favor of the hunting or industrialized farming of human beings for the purpose of consumption. Like, hello, Donner Party of Six. What kind of situation would I have to be in order for me to give up my very visceral physical reaction against eating human meat? It would have to be really dire circumstances. And I don't know that I wouldn't die rather than consume another human being. I'm sure that this is both cultural and it's part of the historical moral prohibition and so on. But I don't see any reason why we shouldn't start producing Soylent Green. I mean, we shouldn't kill people in order to do it, but maybe we should get over the moral prohibition.
Should we pause here with cannibalism as the end of this segment?
We should pause here to just let Rick get eviscerated by the internet for saying that. So we'll be right back after this break.
Yeah.
I was hoping one of you guys would say it, not me.
The next time you eat a hamburger, here's something on which you can chew. The meat inside is mostly made of animal muscle tissue. It doesn't matter if it's chicken or turkey, ham, pork, venison or beef jerky. It's muscle fibers that you chew, commonly are known as food called meat. Muscle fibers from animals we eat, commonly are known as food called meat.
So we've been pretty meat-centric so far in this conversation, and I do want to give the vegans and the vegetarians and the pescatarians their chance in the limelight too. I hear a lot from my friends who don't eat meat that they feel better, that they feel healthier, even putting aside the moral arguments against industrial farming and meat eating. They believe that it's better for them. It's better for their health. And I'm wondering if we ought to take those arguments more seriously, not only to maybe tamp down a little bit the cultural antagonism that is directed at vegans and vegetarians, God bless their souls, it's so hard, it must be, but also to use some of that as an argument to persuade more of us, as I said earlier, to just simply begin by reducing the amount of meat that we eat every year.
It seems to me that from the moment that the federal government in the U.S. inverted the food pyramid, in which meat used to be on the bottom, the medical and health community has recognized and has been promoting a plant-based or a largely plant-based diet. And I think the health effects of being mostly a vegetarian or entirely a vegetarian, and vegan perhaps even better than that, are well known scientifically and to the medical community. And I do think those arguments should be made more often and more vociferously. As a smoker, you could see how compelling health arguments are to me, but I think we should be making them.
So I think the health angle is absolutely important, but I also don't want to miss the other way in which this argument should be made, and that's with regards to sustainability and climate impact of industrialized meat manufacturing. Meat does have a climate impact that is adverse. It does have a carbon footprint that is huge. And if we even reduce the amount of meat we eat, even if we don't go full vegan or full vegetarian, it will have noticeable impact on the health of the planet. So it's not just individual health, but it's on the health of our home that things matter here.
I want to go back, Lee, though, to your saying we should give our vegetarian and vegan friends a shout out, bless their souls, or however you put it, which reminds me of that commercial that has come back around with Tim Walz and his daughter at the Minnesota State Fair, in which he's talking about all the meat they have. And she says, I'm a vegetarian. And he says, well, then you could have turkey. I think that just shows you how frequently vegetarians and vegans are the butt of jokes in popular culture these days.
So they're the butt of the joke in some cases, but I also think it serves a very important cultural moment for us because it shows us that they're much more visible than they were a decade or 2 decades ago. That they are the object of a joke means that we recognize that they're here, they are part of our lives and part of our community, and I think that's important because we can see the traction that is had within thinking about what American culture is.
We've also got to allow for the very real fact that a lot of vegans and vegetarians are vegans and vegetarians for the exact same reason that you and I are meat eaters. That's just their taste. They just prefer vegetables and produce over meat. A lot of people really don't like the taste of meat or the mouthfeel, as they say on the cooking shows, of meat. And I think it's a little bit unfair to the vegans and vegetarians to sort of always expect them to be the moral chorus of our food-eating lives.
Right.
Some people just prefer produce over meat. I do want to say, however, that I think that people who have, over the course of their lives, either developed that taste or just sort of settled into it as a lifestyle, have more than likely grown up in families where there was more cooking done. I don't have any scientific evidence of this, but my hunch is that it's easier to cook meat than it is to prepare vegetables, as a regular diet. It just takes more time, it takes more skill, it takes more knowledge to be a vegetarian than to be a meat eater. I mean, all you really need to cook meat is a fire and meat, right? That's it. Salt and pepper, maybe. So I do think that that's one of the things that we have to remember is that there are a lot of people who might be compelled by the arguments that we've been making here for reducing their meat consumption, but as we mentioned before, just don't have access to quality produce, but maybe also wouldn't know what to do with it if they did.
I live in a neighborhood in Chicago that was for a number of years mostly Puerto Rican, and now it's mostly Puerto Rican and Mexican. And there is produce in my supermarket that I have never seen before. Frequently, they don't have translations of the names of these things. I'm quite sure that I might kill myself or damage myself by trying to eat some of this produce without knowing how to prepare it. I think we often forget how much trial and error had to go into figuring out like how to eat meat or how to eat wheat, how to eat corn, all of these things which are not readily edible, need knowledge to know how to prepare that I don't have for a lot of vegetables. I think also for me, and maybe I'm speaking for all three of us because we're the same generation, I didn't have a vegetable that had any texture until I was like 22 years old.
Yeah, just that slimy beige mush with a piece of meat beside it.
Yeah.
At which point, like every vegetable tastes the same.
So can I ask something that maybe bridges the divide between the meat eaters and the vegetarian vegans? It's this meat alternative stuff that we have that has the convenience of meat, but is plant-based. The Impossible Burgers and the other kinds of new proteins that are being lab-grown or manufactured. Is this an alternative? Are these things opening up some new avenues for people to start eating less meat while not sacrificing what they maybe like in the taste or mouthfeel of the meat products? Or, again, is this more marketing and capitalist opportunity?
I don't feel like I know enough about how Impossible meat is made. I imagine it's impossible to know, but I do have to say that I think it's delicious. And if that is my entree into eating less meat, then I am happy to buy the Impossible meats. I'm not sure that I totally get the arguments that basically amount to, if it's not meat, don't call it meat, right?
Yeah.
If you wanted to be vegetarian, then you should just be vegetarian and don't try to make vegetables into meat, as if they're like, I don't know, filming our team practices on the sideline or something, and stealing our plays. That's just stupid. I mean, I don't care what you call it. If it's delicious and if it helps these larger problems that we've been talking about, yeah, fine. Bring it on.
Go ahead.
I'm with you, Lee. I don't know enough about how it's produced to know its environmental impact and its carbon footprint. For all I know, it could have a greater carbon footprint than producing meat. I just don't know. But I do think that this will be as outrageous as my saying that we probably should eat humans. I do think that when white people discovered umami, suddenly we had a way to talk about what it is we want from meat that could be delivered in non-meat ways.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I've never had an Impossible Burger, but my ex-wife is a vegetarian, and I would want to have, I don't know, biscuits and sausage gravy. And I'm like, what are we going to do? And so I would get the Morningstar Farms plant-based breakfast sausage. And it did the trick. And why? Well, because it had the umami and it had, as both of you have said, the same mouthfeel. I'm with you, Lee. I don't give a shit whether we call that meat. I'm not worried about calling it meat, but I do think it's a way to satisfy the kinds of tastes that I like to have in my mouth without eating animals.
And I want to get to this issue of the nominal problem, what we call meat. I don't have a problem with calling the impossible stuff meat because already the term meat is elastic and it's changed over time.
Yeah.
Catholics used to have Meatless Friday. So what did you have on Meatless Friday?
Fish.
Meat.
You had meat. Fish is meat. So we've been really responsive to the elasticity of the term meat, and we can apply it to plant-based stuff, I think, very easily.
Well, and we already do. Like, we often talk about the meat of a fruit, especially a large fruit, like cut it in half and scoop out the meat of it. And so it is very flexible, I think.
I had a vegetarian friend telling me that he was so glad when Impossible Meat came along because for a lot of vegetarians, you know, if you go into a restaurant and try to ask for a vegetarian option or a vegan option, you're basically just going to get sides
Right.
plus a portobello mushroom cooked like a steak. I mean, that's what you're going to get.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, my ex-wife, she always was prepared in a restaurant with people that she was going to have potatoes in a salad.
Yeah.
Because that's pretty much what the options used to be. But I do want to say something else, that I think the fact now that when people are going to have others over for dinner, it would be unusual for that person not to ask, do you have any dietary preferences?
Yeah.
And I think this shows something you were talking about earlier, Lee. This shows that we are attentive to the fact that people make different choices and we want to accommodate them. We're not going to say, well, I'm not going to serve vegetarian food, so screw you. That's a sign of something really important having changed in our culture.
So there's that shift, and I also see important shifts in the way in which we are learning to prepare food. We are educating an entire generation of chefs and individuals who work in kitchens where preparing things that are not meat-based is normal.
Yeah.
And they have new tools and new approaches to making delicious things out of plant objects that we all enjoy. But you also see it in cookbooks. If you look at a Betty Crocker cookbook from the 1960s, it's meat and then the vegetables that come out of the can, or the salad that's made with, fruit inside Jell-O. That's all at the end of the book. And if you look at the way the cookbook has evolved, there's much more focus on vegetables and fruits and grains, where a much greater range of things are possible. So we are moving in our minds and in our way of addressing our own foods that I think show some important progress.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about this normalization aspect, but now that I'm thinking about it, I'm positive that the last 3 wedding invitations I got gave the option of vegetarian. It's usually like chicken, fish.
Chicken Kiev, salmon, or vegetarian.
Or a portobello mushroom cooked like a steak.
We always used to rate weddings and events by if it was a 2 or 3 meat event.
Yeah.
If you could put on a spread with 3 meats, you had money.
A really great conversation, guys, and it has motivated me to think a lot more about these issues, and in particular to try to figure out how exactly Impossible Meat is made. That's something that's going to bother me until I look this up. But before we get out of here, which we're going to have to do soon because the bartender is making last call, I wanted to get your final thoughts on this conversation and on meat, and whether or not you might be changing your dietary habits as a consequence of this. So, Rick, let me go to you first.
When you said that the bartender made last call, the thought that occurred to me was I was recently at an event and my brother got a Bloody Mary, and the garnishes were shrimp, a sausage, and that shows you how much meat is part of our culture that now it's a garnish to even a Bloody Mary. I mean, I don't really like Bloody Marys, but I'll defend them well enough to say they don't need a sausage in them.
I don't know. I mean, I'm just going to let that one go. It's not a hill I want to die on today. Rick, you okay?
I'll be okay as long as there's not a sausage in my Bloody Mary. Okay. I do want to do research on how these new plant-based meats are produced. By the way, we should say Impossible is a brand name, Beyond Meat another one, and there are other products like this. So we were using Impossible like Band-Aid,
right?
A brand name standing in for the thing of which it is a brand.
Yeah.
And I also want to go back to a point David raised about grains. And I realize we have been impoverished in the United States because when it comes to eating grains, at least in my growing up and my experience, there was a relatively short list of that. It was like rice, wheat. Can't think of another one.
That's it. End of list.
Pasta, chicken,
sausage.
And I was making a recipe the other day that called for farro. I had never had farro, and it is delicious. Like in Polish cuisine, barley.
Kasha.
Yeah. There are other grains, couscous and all sorts of other grains that I'm happy we now have available to us.
So I will follow with many of the things that you two have just said. I also want to know the origins of our artificial meats, just like I want to know about artificial intelligence and get greater transparency about the ways that works. I want greater transparency about artificial meat and how that is derived and where it comes from and what it all means. I think that's important for us. But I will divulge something that I've had in the back of my head. If I ever stop writing about artificial intelligence, I want to write a philosophical cookbook, which will have recipes and a philosophy of food. Because I think this question Nietzsche has, is there a philosophy of nutrition? Yeah, I think there should be. I think we've missed that in our philosophical trajectory. I don't know what it would look like, but I would like to give it a shot.
Well, I just want to say a couple of things. One, David's mention of artificial meats and artificial intelligence led me to think that maybe we should start calling AI impossible intelligence instead of artificial intelligence.
Brand name.
Yeah, you heard it here first, guys. But the second thing is that although it is true that there's not a lot of what we might recognize as a philosophy of food out there, although there is increasingly a lot of it, but not as much as we might think. It has been a long-standing trope in philosophy to talk about rumination, digestion, and in most cases to compare them to thinking. So there's no reason, I agree with you, why we shouldn't have more conversations about food, about what we eat, about how we eat, about the meaning, both moral and social, of eating and what we eat. I think this has been a good start for all of those things. So I'm going to finish up this sausage in my Bloody Mary, and I think we definitely have to get out of here. So I will catch both of you guys next time.
Bye.
Later.